In 1886, the world was told that the eighth wonder of the earth had been vaporized. For over a century, every textbook, every history guild, and every official record maintained a singular, absolute truth, that the pink and white terraces of New Zealand, a massive, silica-charged geothermal masterpiece, were torn apart by the eruption of Mount Tarawera and dragged to a watery grave at the bottom of a new, deeper lake Rotomahana. It was a convenient tragedy. It was a clean ending. But in 2017, the ground began to speak a different story. Forensic cartography and high-resolution bathymetric surveys didn't find a graveyard of shattered stone. Instead, they found something the state had spent 140 years ignoring. The terraces were not destroyed. They were not vaporized. They were sitting right there, intact, preserved, and buried under relatively shallow layers of ash and mud on the lake's shore. This isn't just a geological correction. This is the smoking gun of a century-long investigation into what happens when a natural disaster is weaponized to facilitate a colonial land grab. For 14 decades, the world has been looking at a crime scene and calling it a scenic view. We have been told this place was lost to nature, when the evidence suggests it was abandoned by design. We are standing on a landscape where the soil hides the wealth and the heritage of a displaced nation, kept out of reach by a narrative that deemed it gone, because admitting it remained was an inconvenient logistical nightmare for those in power. If the most significant natural wonder on the planet was merely hidden rather than destroyed, then every decision made by the Crown since 1886, every eviction, every land reclassification, and every refusal to return ancestral territory, is based on a documented falsehood. We are about to look past the high-definition postcards of a pristine Eden. We are going to dig into the tactical silence that defines the New Zealand archipelago. Because the most dangerous thing about this land isn't the volcanoes. It is the truth they were used to bury. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know exactly how far these hidden stories are reaching. The 10th of June, 1886, began with a violent, basaltic eruption that should have been a moment of collective mourning for a natural masterpiece. Mount Tarawera didn't just split the sky, it redefined the map of the North Island. Yet, as the ash settled, a second, more calculated disaster began to unfold in the halls of colonial administration. The pink and white terraces, or Te Otikaporangi and Te Tarada, were the crown jewels of the burgeoning tourism industry, the eighth wonder of the world that drew global elites to the edge of the Pacific. To the British Crown, these silica basins were a goldmine, but to the indigenous Tuhurangi people, they were the ancestral backbone of their economy and identity. In the immediate aftermath, the official narrative hardened with suspicious speed. Government surveyors and experts of the era declared the site a total loss. They argued that the explosive force had either vaporized the terraces entirely or plunged them into a bottomless abyss of volcanic slurry. This wasteland verdict was not a scientific consensus, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. By officially categorizing the most valuable geothermal site on the planet as destroyed, the government effectively liquidated the Tuhurangi's primary source of leverage. If the wonder was gone, the state reasoned, there was no longer a reason to protect the indigenous guardianship of the surrounding district. The land was reclassified as Crown Land, a blank slate for colonial reorganization. This was the birth of the tactical silence. The authorities didn't just stop searching for the terraces, they actively discouraged any investigation that suggested they might still exist. They built a national brand on the tragedy of Tarawera, using the supposed loss of the terraces to justify the mass acquisition of the surrounding thermal regions. What the world was told was a geological finality was, in reality, a convenient closing of the books. Every map printed after 1886 was a document of erasure, purposefully omitting the possibility of recovery. The official records were not designed to preserve history, they were designed to bury the Tuhurangi's future under a layer of administrative ash. We are looking at a century of state-sanctioned blindness, where science was used as a veil to hide the fact that the most famous natural wonder on Earth was sitting just a few meters beneath the surface of a manufactured narrative. To understand the weight of this erasure, we must look at the human cost, the lives that were treated as collateral damage in the name of a natural disaster. Before the eruption, the Tuhurangi were one of the wealthiest and most influential iwi tribes in the region. They were pioneers of the tourism industry, managing the guides, the transport, and the hospitality for thousands of international visitors. They held the keys to the terraces, and by extension, a level of economic independence that the colonial government found deeply threatening. When the wasteland verdict was handed down, it wasn't just the stone basins that were declared dead, it was the Tuhurangi's right to their own land. With their primary economic engine supposedly vaporized, the survivors were treated not as citizens who had lost their livelihoods, but as obstacles to be cleared. They were displaced, scattered to neighboring regions like Wakarwerwa, and forced into a state of permanent dependency. The government used the tragedy as a pretext to tighten its grip on the Rotorua district, stripping the indigenous owners of their management rights under the guise of public safety and national interest. The psychological impact was a calculated blow. Imagine being told by the most powerful authorities on earth that your sacred sites, the places that defined your lineage and your wealth, simply no longer existed. To protest the land grab was to fight a phantom. How do you claim ownership of something the state has officially declared non-existent? This is the core of Pillar 3, deliberate erasure. The state didn't just take the land, they took the evidence of the land. By the time 20th century tourism reached its peak, the Tuhurangi had been largely written out of the story of their own wonders. The hidden truth here is that the displacement wasn't a side effect of the volcano, it was the goal of the narrative that followed it. The survivors were left to watch as the government marketed a new New Zealand, one that capitalized on the lost terraces to sell a brand of prehistoric mystery, while the actual owners of that mystery lived in exile on the fringes of their own territory. The soil didn't just bury the silica, it buried a nation's right to exist on its own terms. If the pink and white terraces, the most scrutinized natural marvel of the 19th century, could be lost by a simple stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, we have to ask a much darker question. What else has this archipelago hidden in the name of conservation and progress? The discovery in 2017 didn't just change our understanding of Lake Rotomahana, it shattered the credibility of the entire state-sponsored history of New Zealand. It proved that the official narrative is not a record of truth, but a filter designed to protect the interests of those who drew the maps. This realization forces us to move our investigation from the buried mud of the north to the isolated, pristine coastlines of the archipelago. We are about to look at the very foundation of New Zealand's global identity, its reputation as a world leader in environmental protection. While the world sees a noble effort to save the planet, we are going to uncover a blueprint for green colonialism. We will investigate how the concept of the natural wonder was weaponized once again, not with volcanic ash this time, but with the language of biodiversity and scientific preservation. We are heading to Hoturu, Little Barrier Island, the place where the modern island sanctuary model was born. But as we will see, this sanctuary wasn't built on a foundation of peace, it was built on the ashes of burned homes and the forced removal of the Ngatiwai people. The loop is now open. If the terraces were a lie of convenience, then the untouched wilderness of the New Zealand coast is a lie of design. We are about to prove that the silence of these forests isn't the sound of nature, it is the sound of a forced vacancy. We are digging deeper into the tactical erasure that created the Pure New Zealand brand, a brand that relies on you never asking who had to be deleted to make the landscape look this perfect. The investigation into the unseen wonders is only just beginning. And the next layer of the truth is even more disturbing than the last. The 1859 field diaries of Ferdinand von Hochstetter represent the only forensic anchor we have in an ocean of state-sponsored revisionism. Hochstetter was a geologist who did not merely observe the landscape, he recorded it with a mathematical precision that the later colonial surveyors found deeply inconvenient. His journals contain the exact compass bearings and topographical intersections of the terraces, creating a coordinate grid that existed long before the eruption of 1886. When the government later claimed the site was vaporized, they were not just contradicting a theory, they were contradicting a documented, physical reality. Hochstetter's data remained the primary threat to the total loss narrative because it provided a map to a treasure the crown wanted to remain buried. The state had to wait for the generation that knew the land to die out before they could successfully reclassify the region. By the time the 20th century arrived, the specific coordinates in these diaries were treated as historical curiosities rather than active investigative leads. The authorities relied on the passage of time to erode the relevance of the only accurate survey ever conducted. They calculated that a public without a map would eventually stop asking where the treasure was hidden. Yet, the 2017 discovery proved that the numbers in those 1859 diaries were correct all along. The land had not moved, the government had simply moved the truth out of the public's reach. This was the first layer of a calculated silence that would last for over a century. In 1887, only months after the ash had cooled, the Department of Lands and Survey executed a pivot that would define the geography of the North Island for the next 100 years. Without a single underwater dive or a comprehensive excavation, official state maps were altered. The designation for the pink and white terraces shifted from location unknown to site destroyed. This was a linguistic sleight of hand disguised as a cartographic update. By marking the site as destroyed, the government bypassed the legal requirement to search for it. If a wonder is lost, it is a tragedy. If it is destroyed, it is a legal finality. This allowed the Crown to reorganize the surrounding territory without the burden of indigenous land claims tied to a world-famous landmark. The maps were not reflections of the Earth's surface, they were tools of administrative convenience. They created a reality where the Tuhurangi people had nothing left to return to. The authorities knew that as long as the map said "destroyed," the physical truth remained irrelevant. They weaponized the vacuum left by the disaster to fill the void with their own version of history. Every map printed thereafter served as a reinforcement of this lie, ensuring that any researcher or descendant who questioned the narrative would be fighting against the weight of the state's own official geography. This was the moment the landscape was officially stripped of its history and prepared for its new role as a managed colonial asset. The bureaucracy of absence functioned as a legal vacuum, where the lost wonder narrative was used to systematically strip the Tuhurangi of their ancestral holdings. Under the New Zealand legal framework of the time, land that was deemed unproductive or waste could be more easily brought under Crown control. By declaring the geothermal heart of the region a volcanic wasteland, the government effectively severed the link between the people and their heritage. They didn't just take the land, they declared that the land the people claimed no longer existed in any recognizable form. This reclassification was a cold, administrative act that turned a thriving indigenous economy into a blank space on a ledger. The Tuhurangi were told that their rights were tied to a ghost. The state used the tragedy to justify the Little Barrier Island style of clearance, where the removal of the people was framed as a necessary response to a natural catastrophe. This allowed for the consolidation of the Rotorua district under a centralized tourism board, one that would eventually profit from the myth of the lost terraces while the actual owners remained in economic exile. The silence of the maps was matched by the silence of the law. The government ensured that there were no legal avenues for reclamation because, on paper, there was nothing left to reclaim. This was the blueprint for a century of territorial dispossession disguised as disaster management. Throughout the 20th century, the official story of total vaporization began to show cracks that the state could no longer easily ignore. Researchers like Lloyd Keane began to flag the mathematical and physical impossibilities inherent in the government's theory. If the terraces had been vaporized by a hydrothermal blast of that magnitude, the energy release would have left a signature on the surrounding landscape that simply wasn't there. The math didn't add up. The volume of material required to fill the new lake bed didn't account for the survival of the silica structures. Yet, for decades, these discrepancies were treated as fringe theories or academic outliers. The government maintained its wasteland verdict with a rigidity that suggested the truth was a threat to national stability. This was a classic case of administrative inertia meeting a buried truth. The Smith-Keane findings suggested that the terraces were likely pushed into the mud or covered by a collapse of the crater wall, meaning they were recoverable. Admitting this would have required the state to reopen the land claims of 1886, a prospect that was financially and politically unthinkable. The authorities chose to protect the narrative over the evidence, ensuring that the lost wonder remained lost for the sake of the status quo. The investigation was not stalled by a lack of technology, it was stalled by a lack of political will. The truth was sitting in plain sight in the data, waiting for a generation that was no longer afraid to challenge the official maps. The price of acknowledgement was a debt the New Zealand government was never prepared to pay. To admit that the pink and white terraces were intact was to admit that the last 130 years of land management were built on a fraudulent foundation. If the terraces existed, the Tuhurangi's claim to the eighth wonder of the world remained active and legally binding. The potential cost of returning the site, or compensating the tribe for a century of lost tourism revenue, reached into the billions. It was far cheaper to maintain the lie of destruction than to confront the reality of preservation. This economic reality dictated the state's investigative posture. They didn't avoid the truth because they were incompetent, they avoided it because they were calculated. Every year the terraces remained lost was another year the Crown could avoid a massive settlement. This is the unseen wonder of the legal system, its ability to make a physical object disappear through the sheer weight of financial liability. The state-sanctioned erasure was a protective measure for the national treasury. The displacement of the indigenous people was not an accident of history, but a cost-saving measure that was enforced by every government since the eruption. The survival of the terraces represented a massive, unrealized liability on the state's balance sheet. By keeping the truth buried under the lake's mud, the government kept its own history from being called into question in a court of law. The 2017 bathymetric discovery didn't just find stone, it found a legacy of deception. When the sonar images revealed the distinct shapes of the terraces sitting precisely where the 19th century diaries said they would be, the 131-year cover-up officially collapsed. This modern echo proved that the official maps were not just wrong, they were a deliberate rejection of the available evidence. The revelation has forced a permanent shift in how we view the New Zealand landscape. It is no longer a place of accidental tragedies, but a place of managed truths. The loop that began with a volcanic eruption has closed with a forensic confirmation. We now know that the silence of the forests and the stillness of the lakes are often products of a narrative designed to hide the human cost of the land. The terraces remain underwater, still largely inaccessible to the people who own them, serving as a silent monument to what was taken in the name of a lie. This investigation proves that the most important features of a country are often the ones the government has worked the hardest to remove from the map. The soil and the water hold the secrets that the state-sponsored brand refuses to acknowledge. As we move forward into the more isolated regions of the archipelago, we carry this lesson with us. In this land, a natural wonder is often just a code word for a buried crime. The investigation continues, and the next layer of the truth will take us to the birthplace of the modern sanctuary, where the erasure of a people was framed as an act of grace. In 1894, a new and dangerous ideology was drafted in the sterile offices of the New Zealand colonial government. It was the birth of the Laboratory of Purity. For the first time, the state proposed a radical definition of nature, one that required the total absence of human life to be considered authentic. This was not a scientific discovery, it was a philosophical pivot designed to solve a territorial problem. The island of Haturu, known to the world as Little Barrier Island, was identified as the perfect site for this experiment. The government claimed that the only way to save endangered species like the haihai or the tuatara was to create a vacuum where no human foot could fall. This narrative intentionally ignored the fact that the Ngatiwai people had lived in harmony with these species for centuries. Their presence was suddenly reclassified as a form of contamination. By framing environmentalism as a zero-sum game between people and birds, the state created a moral justification for a cold, bureaucratic clearance. The sanctuary model was never about the birds alone, it was about establishing a new form of state control over isolated territories. The authorities realized that if they could define a landscape as a natural wonder, in need of protection, they could legally override the rights of the people who owned it. This was the opening move in a campaign to sever the link between the indigenous population and the soil, using the language of science to mask the mechanics of a land grab. The forest was being prepared for its new role as a managed, empty monument to a state-sanctioned version of the wild. The Little Barrier Island Acquisition Act of 1894 stands as a forensic monument to legislative theft. This was not a standard property deal, it was a forced seizure disguised as an emergency environmental mandate. The Crown had been trying to purchase the island for years, but the Ngatiwai leaders had consistently refused to sell their ancestral home. When diplomacy failed, the government reached for the law. This specific act allowed the state to bypass the usual protections of indigenous land titles by declaring the island a site of national importance for the preservation of flora and fauna. It was a targeted strike against a specific community, using the power of the parliament to solve a local real estate dispute. The legislation turned the very existence of the Ngatiwai on Haturu into a legal anomaly. Suddenly, the people who had inhabited the ridges and valleys for generations were classified as squatters on their own soil. The act provided the thin veneer of legality required for the state to move from negotiation to coercion. It was a cold, calculated document that prioritized the purity of the landscape over the lives of the humans who shaped it. The government used the law to create a reality where the land was more valuable as an empty museum than as a living home. This was the moment that green, in New Zealand's brand, became a tool of the state, proving that the most effective way to take land was to claim you were saving it for the future of the planet. The resistance to this clearance was led by figures of immense tenacity, Tenatahi and his wife, Rawi Tekiri. They were not just residents, they were the legal guardians of the Ngatiwai's claim to Haturu. For over a decade, they fought the Crown's bureaucratic machine with a sophisticated understanding of both indigenous and colonial law. Tenatahi recognized that the sanctuary model was a Trojan horse for dispossession. He argued that the birds and the people were part of a single, inseparable ecosystem. While the government experts spoke of purity, Tenatahi spoke of belonging. He refused to accept the state's financial offers, correctly identifying that once the link to the land was broken, it could never be restored with gold. His defense was so effective that it stalled the government's plans for years, forcing the state to increasingly desperate measures. The authorities were embarrassed by a single family that refused to be moved by either bribes or threats. Rawi Tekiri, a woman of high rank and spiritual authority, stood beside him, embodying the ancestral connection that the state was trying to erase. Their struggle proves that the clearance of Haturu was not a peaceful transition or a quiet agreement. It was a high-stakes legal and physical battle between a family defending their home and a government determined to turn that home into a laboratory. The state's eventual victory was not a triumph of logic or conservation, but a triumph of superior force. Tenetahi and Rawi were the last line of defense against an ideology that viewed their humanity as a biological threat to the wonder of the island. In 1896, the state finally abandoned the pretense of legal negotiation and moved to open warfare. The eviction of the Ngati Y was a police raid executed with the cold efficiency of a military operation. Armed officers landed on the shores of Haturu, not to protect the environment, but to burn the homes of the people who had protected it for centuries. They moved through the settlements, forcing families out of their weir and destroying the crops that sustained them. This was the violent reality behind the sanctuary model. The state did not just move the people, they deleted the evidence of their lives. The smoke rising from the burning houses was the physical manifestation of the state's new definition of nature. By the time the police were finished, the human history of the island was reduced to ash. The survivors were taken to the mainland and left with nothing, their ancestral wealth and spiritual center now a restricted zone owned by the crown. This was not a tragedy of history, it was a deliberate act of state-sanctioned arson. The government had decided that the unseen wonder of Haturu required a clean slate, and they were willing to use fire to achieve it. The pristine forest that modern visitors see is growing over the charred remains of a community that was sacrificed to provide a guilt-free postcard of untouched wilderness. The eviction was a clear message: in the new New Zealand, the land belongs to the state's vision, and the people are merely temporary obstacles to be cleared when the brand requires a vacancy. The clearance of Haturu provided the global blueprint for what is now recognized as green colonialism. This island became the model for national parks and restricted sanctuaries across the world, a system where environmental protection is used as a legal justification for the displacement of indigenous populations. The New Zealand government demonstrated that by framing land as a natural wonder, they could effectively weaponize the concept of the common good to silence local dissent. If the goal is to save the world, then the removal of a few families is presented as a small, necessary price to pay. This ideology has been exported from these shores to every corner of the globe, creating a world where the most protected places on Earth are often the sites of the most profound historical injustices. The green brand allows the state to maintain a high moral ground while continuing the work of territorial expansion. It relies on a carefully managed public perception, the idea that nature is something that exists only when humans are absent. This narrative is a powerful tool for erasure because it makes the vacancy feel natural rather than forced. When you look at the restricted access and the high-definition footage of rare species, you are seeing the success of this blueprint. The state has successfully trained the world to see the birds but not the people who were cleared to make room for them. Haturu is the birthplace of a managed reality where the environment is used as a shield to protect the state from the consequences of its own history of dispossession. Today, the silence of the canopy on Haturu is not a natural phenomenon, it is a product of historical trauma. The island is one of the most restricted places on Earth, accessible only to a small elite of scientists and state-authorized permit holders. This total exclusion ensures that the pristine narrative remains unchallenged. There are no monuments to Tenetahi or Rawi Tekiri under the trees. There is no mention of the 1896 fire in the official brochures that celebrate the island's biodiversity. The unseen wonder here is the sheer effectiveness of the mask. The state has created a space where the history of the Ngati is treated as a classified document, hidden behind the high-resolution imagery of rare wildlife. When the public is shown the Hai or the Tuatara, they are being given a distraction, a beautiful, living reason to never ask what lies beneath the forest floor. The sanctuary functions as a geopolitical vault, keeping the ancestral owners at a distance while the state reaps the diplomatic and branding rewards of its world-leading conservation efforts. This is the ultimate hidden truth of the New Zealand landscape. The more untouched a place appears, the more likely it is that a great deal of effort went into touching it, violently, to make it look that way. The investigation into the unseen wonders of this archipelago reveals a pattern that repeats across the Southern Alps and the fjords of the south. The wilderness is a manufactured vacancy, and the silence of these forests is the sound of a story that was buried on purpose to make room for a brand. The World Heritage designation for the Southern Alps and Fjordland functions as a sophisticated layer of cartographic erasure. To the global community, these mountains represent a prehistoric void, a fragment of the earth that has remained untouched since the dawn of time. However, the legal reality is far more calculated. By classifying vast tracts of the South Island as primitive areas and wilderness zones, the state has effectively reclassified ancient Maori transit routes as accidental features of the landscape. These were never empty spaces. They were the arterial veins of a civilization that navigated the high-altitude passes with a precision that predates colonial mapping by centuries. The government used the World Heritage brand to cement a narrative of human absence, turning a lived-in geography into a static museum. This was not a conservationist victory, it was a territorial maneuver. By defining the land as wilderness, the state legally removed the possibility of indigenous occupation or industry. The maps were redrawn to exclude the history of the people who named every peak and river long before a European surveyor ever sighted them. This is the first layer of the manufactured wild, a landscape that has been scrubbed of its human identity to serve a modern global brand. The state-sponsored image of a prehistoric sanctuary relies on the total removal of the ancestral footsteps that once defined these ridges. Deep within the supposedly untouched forests of the South Island, the soil holds evidence that contradicts the state's wilderness narrative. Forensic surveys have uncovered charcoal deposits and the remains of ancient hearths buried beneath the moss and canopy of Fjordland. These are the charred structural remains of Maori shelters, physical proof of a permanent human presence in a region the government claims was a vacant mystery. These hearths were not accidental fires, they were the centers of domestic life and industrial transit. Finding these sites deep within a designated wilderness area exposes the fundamental dishonesty of the current conservation model. If these forests were truly untouched, these charcoal signatures would not exist. Their presence suggests that the pristine environment we see today is actually a secondary growth, a forest that has reclaimed a landscape once actively managed by human hands. The state has worked to keep these archaeological findings out of the public eye, preferring to maintain the illusion of a prehistoric void. Acknowledging these remains would mean admitting that the wilderness is a recent invention, a vacancy created by the removal of the people who once called these mountains home. The charcoal is the smoking gun of a displaced history, sitting silently beneath the feet of trekkers who believe they are walking through a land that has never known the touch of a human flame. The Southern Alps are marketed as an empty, formidable alpine barrier, but the historical reality is that they were a thriving hub of indigenous industry. For centuries, these peaks were the primary source of pounamu, or greenstone, the most valuable commodity in the Maori world. This was not a casual gathering of stones, it was a high-stakes, high-altitude extraction and trade network that linked the west coast to the rest of the archipelago. The routes over the mountain passes were industrial highways, maintained and protected by the tribes who managed the resource. To define this region as an empty wilderness is to ignore the complex economic and spiritual transit that once defined the high country. The state-sponsored narrative of a prehistoric void serves to hide the fact that this was a landscape of labor, ownership, and territorial rights. By framing the Alps as a natural wonder, devoid of human history, the government avoids the logistical and legal nightmare of acknowledging the mining and trade rights that were never officially extinguished. The unseen wonder here is the sheer scale of the historical trade that occurred in these valleys, a network of commerce and culture that was silenced to make room for a pure New Zealand brand. The mountains were never a barrier to the people who lived here. They were a source of life and power that the modern state has chosen to treat as a vacant mystery. The National Parks Act and the creation of wilderness areas function as a legal fence, designed to prevent indigenous tribes from reclaiming their right to manage the ancestral land. Under this legislation, any form of human infrastructure or permanent occupation is strictly prohibited within these designated zones. While this is framed as a noble effort to protect the environment, the investigative reality is that it acts as a tactical barrier to land reclamation. If a tribe successfully proves their ancestral link to a specific valley, they are met with a legal paradox. They may own the land, but they are prohibited by law from living on it or using it according to their traditions. The state has used the concept of the wilderness to lock the land in a state of permanent vacancy, ensuring that the Crown remains the ultimate arbiter of how the geography is used. This is a sophisticated form of dispossession that uses environmentalism as its primary weapon. By reclassifying a lived-in history as a natural wonder that must be protected from human contamination, the government has effectively severed the link between the people and the soil. The legal fence is invisible, but it is as real as any physical boundary. It ensures that the pristine nature of the South Island remains a state-managed asset, far out of reach of the people whose ancestors built the very trails that the modern world now calls undiscovered. The modern Great Walks are one of New Zealand's most successful tourism exports, but they are built directly over the top of ancestral Maori trails. This is the ultimate tourism veil, a system where the public is charged a fee to walk over a history that the state claims never existed. These paths were not discovered by colonial explorers. They were ancient trade and transit routes that had been in use for generations. The government has effectively commodified the indigenous geography, turning a spiritual and historical transit into a commercial product. While the hikers are told they are experiencing the great outdoors, they are rarely told they are walking on an ancient road that was once part of a thriving industrial network. The infrastructure of the walks, the huts, the bridges, the signage, is designed to reinforce the idea of the state as the benevolent protector of a prehistoric void. This commercialization serves as a layer of erasure, replacing the deep, human history of the trails with a surface-level, outdoor experience. The state-sponsored brand relies on the hiker believing they are a pioneer in an empty land, rather than a customer in a managed theme park. The unseen wonder is the historical depth of the soil beneath the gravel of the tracks, a depth that is systematically ignored to maintain the high-definition aesthetics of the 4K postcard. The trails are the physical manifestation of a history that has been paved over to serve the global elite. The archaeological reality of these mountains stands in stark contrast to the modern state-sponsored image of a prehistoric void. From the buried hearths of Fjordland to the greenstone trails of the Alps, the geography of the South Island is a crowded archive of human endeavor. The silence that visitors experience in these wilderness areas is not the original silence of the earth, it is a manufactured vacancy. It is the silence of a forced vacancy, created by the legal and physical removal of the people who once filled these valleys with life. The investigation proves that the manufactured wilderness is a tool of the state, a way to manage and monetize the landscape while avoiding the uncomfortable truths of its history. We have been trained to see a pristine sanctuary, but the evidence suggests we are looking at a geographical graveyard. The unseen is not just what is hidden beneath the canopy, but the intentional choice to treat a lived-in history as an empty mystery. As we move deeper into the investigation, we see that this pattern of erasure is not limited to the forests and the mountains. It extends into the very valleys that are now used to monitor the rest of the world. The Pure New Zealand brand is a mask that hides not just the crimes of the past, but the surveillance of the present. The investigation into the unseen wonders is moving from the earth to the sky, where the next layer of the truth is waiting to be uncovered. The weaponization of biodiversity functions as a superior legal mandate that effectively supersedes the ancestral land rights of the indigenous population. In the modern era, the New Zealand government has elevated species protection to a state-level priority that operates outside the normal boundaries of property law. By identifying a specific bird or plant as a critically endangered asset, the Crown gains the authority to freeze all human activity within that habitat. This is not a neutral act of science, it is a tactical deployment of environmental law to maintain territorial control. When a region is designated as a high-value conservation zone, the original owners are legally stripped of their right to occupy, manage, or even walk upon their own soil. The state frames this as a noble sacrifice for the sake of the planet, but the investigative reality is that it functions as a permanent barrier to land reclamation. This narrative ensures that the common good of biodiversity always outweighs the specific right of indigenous ownership. The land is no longer a home. It is a state-managed biological laboratory where the presence of the original people is treated as a liability rather than a legacy. This shift in the legal landscape has turned the forest into a fortress, protected by a wall of environmental regulations that are impossible for local communities to penetrate. The hai-hai, or stitch bird, has become one of the most effective geopolitical tools in the state's arsenal of exclusion. Because the species is classified as exceptionally fragile and susceptible to human-borne diseases, its presence is used as the primary justification for keeping the Ngatiwai and other tribes off their ancestral islands. The government maintains a narrative that the mere footprint of an unauthorized person could trigger a biological collapse. This creates a state of permanent emergency that allows the Crown to bypass the normal processes of consultation and return. The fragility of the bird is weaponized to justify a policy of total human clearance. While the official documents speak of nesting patterns and fungal spores, the underlying result is the continued separation of a people from their spiritual center. The hai-hai is not just a bird in this context, it is a living lock on the gate of the sanctuary. By centering the entire management of the land around the survival of a single, sensitive species, the state makes the exclusion of humans seem like a scientific necessity rather than a political choice. This is the unseen wonder of the conservation model. It uses the beauty and rarity of nature to shield the state from the moral and legal consequences of its history of dispossession. The bureaucracy of permits creates a two-tier system of access that exposes the fundamental inequality of the conservation model. While the indigenous owners are banned from their land on the grounds of biological risk, state-approved scientists and international researchers are granted high-level permits to fly in and out of these restricted zones. This suggests that contamination is a selective threat, one that applies to the people whose ancestors lived there for centuries, but not to the professionals who arrive with government credentials. This permit system functions as a gatekeeping mechanism that ensures only the state's version of the land is ever recorded. The researchers who study the flora and fauna are often discouraged from investigating the archaeological evidence of the people who were cleared to make the study possible. This creates a vacuum of information where the human history of the sanctuary is systematically ignored in favor of botanical data. The indigenous people are treated as a biological threat to be managed, while the state-sanctioned elite are treated as the objective observers of a prehistoric void. This administrative wall ensures that the link between the people and the soil remains severed, while the government reaps the global prestige of its world-leading scientific efforts on land that it legally seized under the guise of an emergency. The myth of the pest-free Eden relies on a hidden reality of industrial-scale poisoning that the state-sponsored brand refuses to acknowledge. In the name of creating a pure environment for endangered species, the New Zealand government conducts massive aerial drops of 1080, a potent toxin designed to eradicate invasive mammals. This chemical intervention is marketed as a necessary tool for conservation, but it has a devastating impact on the soil and the water systems that local communities once relied upon. The investigative reality is that this purity is achieved through a cycle of toxic saturation. The state frames this as a war against pests, a narrative that masks the long-term ecological consequences of raining poison over the landscape. For the indigenous tribes who still live near these zones, the drops represent a direct threat to their traditional food sources and their health. The government's insistence on this method proves that the goal is not a natural ecosystem, but a managed, artificial one that fits a specific scientific profile. The clean green image of the archipelago is built on a foundation of chemical warfare against the very earth it claims to protect. This cycle of poisoning is the dirty secret of the sanctuary model, a violent intervention that is justified by the same biodiversity narrative used to exclude the people from the land. The human consequence of this exclusion is a profound and painful severance of the connection between a people and their ancestral identity. When the state legally bans the Ngati and other tribes from their land, it is not just a matter of property, it is the destruction of a living culture. These people are prohibited from gathering traditional medicine, performing ancestral rites, or passing on the history of specific ridges and valleys to the next generation. The land is the archive of their lineage, and by locking that archive, the state is effectively erasing their future. This is the tactical silence in action, a policy that waits for the oral traditions and the specific knowledge of the soil to die out through lack of use. The government understands that if a people cannot touch their land, they will eventually lose the ability to claim it. This is a cold, calculated form of cultural attrition disguised as environmental protection. The grief and the sense of betrayal felt by these communities are the invisible costs of the Pure New Zealand brand. The state celebrates the wilderness, while the people who shaped it are forced to watch from across a legal fence, their history treated as a relic of a primitive past that has no place in a modern, scientific sanctuary. The final layer of this exclusion is the conservation paywall, where the state-sanctioned removal of local people makes room for a high-value ecotourism industry. While the indigenous owners are treated as a risk to the ecosystem, the global elite are invited to visit these restricted zones through expensive, state-authorized tours. This creates a Vatican-style exclusion zone where only the wealthy can afford the natural experience that was once a birthright. The government uses the biodiversity narrative to limit supply, thereby driving up the price of access for an international market that craves the illusion of untouched nature. This commodification of the sanctuary proves that the vacancy is a commercial asset. The unseen wonder here is the structural inequality baked into the geography. The land is too fragile for the people who belong to it, but just stable enough for those who can pay for a permit. This transformation of ancestral soil into a managed theme park for the world's winners is the ultimate hidden truth of the New Zealand conservation model. The state has successfully turned a site of historical trauma into a source of high-definition aesthetics and economic gain, ensuring that the history of the losers remains buried beneath the high-value brand of the winners. The investigation now moves from the forests to the valleys, where the next layer of the truth reveals a nation that is not just watching its birds, but watching the entire world. The pastoral landscape of the Marlborough region presents a carefully maintained visual discrepancy that hides a global nerve center. To the uninitiated, the rolling sheep paddocks and award-winning vineyards of the Waihopai Valley are the pinnacle of the New Zealand agrarian brand. But as the road winds deeper into the valley, the geography shifts from the organic to the industrial. Two massive, white geodesic domes rise from the earth, looking less like agricultural infrastructure and more like a fragment of a futuristic occupation. These radomes are not weather stations, and they are not telecommunications hubs for the local population. They are the physical manifestation of a multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus that functions in total silence. The government has gone to great lengths to ensure these structures are seen as a benign part of the landscape, yet their presence is a jarring contradiction to the Green Eden narrative. The sheep graze in the literal shadow of a facility that intercepts millions of private communications across the southern hemisphere every single day. This is the first layer of the digital fortress, a site where the natural beauty of the South Island is used as a scenic mask for a state-sponsored listening post. The valley is not just a place of production, it is a place of extraction, where data is harvested with the same cold efficiency as the surrounding grapes, all under the guise of national security. In the mid-1980s, New Zealand famously declared itself a nuclear-free zone, a move that was marketed as a bold statement of independence and peaceful isolation. Yet, while the public celebrated this break from the nuclear umbrella, the state was quietly constructing a global intelligence nerve center in the Waihopai Valley. This is the nuclear-free mirage. The government maintained a public posture of neutrality and pacifist defiance while simultaneously deepening its integration into the most powerful spy network on the planet. The construction of the Waihopai station in 1989 was a strategic trade-off. By providing a southern gear for international intelligence partners, the New Zealand government ensured it remained a critical player in global geopolitics, despite its anti-nuclear rhetoric. This contradiction reveals a profound gap between the national brand and the state's actual behavior. The independent nation was, in reality, a silent partner in the very systems of global surveillance it claimed to transcend. The radomes are a monument to this hypocrisy, a physical proof that while the ships were banned from the harbors, the data was still flowing freely into the vaults of foreign interests. The public was given a sense of moral victory, while the state secured its place at the table of global power through the back door of the Waihopai Valley. The anatomy of a radome reveals a high-tech architecture of total interception. These geodesic spheres are designed to protect sensitive satellite tracking dishes from the elements, but their primary function is to shield the direction of those dishes from public view. By hiding the orientation of the antennas, the state ensures that no one can easily determine which satellites are being targeted for data harvesting. This is a geography of concealment. Inside these domes, massive receivers are tuned to the specific frequencies of international communications satellites orbiting above the Pacific. They are not sending signals, they are vacuuming them up. Every phone call, every email, and every burst of satellite data that passes through this sector of the sky is vulnerable to the invisible net cast by these structures. The government maintains that this facility is necessary for foreign intelligence, a term that is kept deliberately vague to avoid public scrutiny. The radomes act as a physical barrier between the citizens and the truth of what is happening in their own backyard. They are the ears of a state that has decided that the privacy of the southern hemisphere is a resource to be exploited rather than a right to be protected. The investigation into these structures proves that the silence of the valley is a technical requirement, not a natural feature. The Government Communications Security Bureau, or GCSB, is the state agency tasked with the management of the Waihopai site. Its legal mandate has undergone a quiet but radical evolution since the station's inception. Originally framed as a domestic agency focused on high-level national threats, the GCSB has transitioned into a global listening post that serves as a vital node for international partners. This evolution happened behind a wall of legislative secrecy, where the true scale of the Bureau's operations was hidden from the very people who fund it. The GCSB does not just monitor foreign threats, it manages the flow of information that defines New Zealand's geopolitical value. By controlling the Waihopai station, the Bureau holds a unique leverage in the intelligence community, providing data that no other nation can easily access from the Northern Hemisphere. This has turned a local government department into a powerful, unaccountable entity that operates with a level of autonomy that challenges the democratic foundations of the nation. The mandate is built on the idea that the state's need for information supersedes the individual's right to privacy. The GCSB is the architect of the digital occupation, using the geography of the South Island to build a surveillance apparatus that is as expansive as it is invisible. The residents of the Waihopai Valley live in a world where the local cost of global secrets is a permanent state of surveillance. While the world sees a scenic wine-growing region, the families who have farmed this land for generations exist in the literal shadow of a multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus. Their private lives are framed by the white domes on the horizon, a constant reminder that the state is always listening. The human consequence of this facility is a profound erosion of trust and a sense of being occupied by one's own government. The valley is no longer a community in the traditional sense. It is a high-security zone where the movement of people is monitored and the quiet of the rural life is punctuated by the hum of cooling systems for massive servers. There is an uncomfortable intimacy between the domestic life of the farmers and the global operations of the spy station. The state has effectively privatized the landscape, turning a public valley into a restricted enclave for secrets that the residents were never meant to know. This is the unseen wonder of the surveillance state, its ability to transform a home into a target and a neighbor into a monitor. The people of Waihopai are the first victims of a digital occupation that has since spread across the entire archipelago, proving that the state's hunger for data knows no geographical or moral bounds. The invisible net cast from the Waihopai Valley is the final layer of the digital occupation. The physical infrastructure of the domes is merely the tip of the spear. Below the ground, a web of fiber optic cables and high-speed data links connects this isolated valley to the intelligence hubs of the world. This station is not an island, it is a critical artery in a global system of control. By intercepting the communications of the Pacific, New Zealand provides the raw material for a surveillance machine that monitors diplomatic allies, industrial rivals, and private citizens alike. The unseen wonder here is the sheer scale of the reach. From this one valley, the state can touch the lives of millions of people who will never see the white domes or know the name of the agency that is watching them. This is the reality of the digital fortress, a nation that has traded its Green Eden reputation for a seat at the table of global surveillance. The investigation now moves from the physical domes of the South to the digital partnership that makes this all possible. We are about to uncover the Echelon Network, the secret treaty that turned a neutral island into a silent partner in global intelligence operations. The silence of the South was never about peace, it was about ensuring the signal was clear. The AUKUSA alliance functions as the silent legal architecture that ended New Zealand's status as a truly independent nation. While the public celebrated the anti-nuclear stance of the 1980s, the state was tightening a secret treaty that bound the country to the Five Eyes intelligence network. This agreement was not a partnership of equals, it was a pact of digital integration. By signing on to the AUKUSA protocols, the New Zealand government agreed to align its domestic surveillance capabilities with the strategic interests of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. This treaty effectively turned the South Island into a geographic asset for foreign powers. The independence marketed to the world was a thin layer of political theater. Behind the closed doors of the GCSB, the nation's sovereignty was being traded for access to high-level global data streams. This alliance created a reality where the state serves two masters, the local electorate and the international intelligence directors. The result is a nation that speaks the language of peace while hosting the machinery of global monitoring. This was the moment the archipelago was officially drafted into a digital conflict that the public was never invited to join. The AUKUSA alliance is the invisible tether that ensures New Zealand can never truly step away from the global surveillance machine, regardless of which political party holds the keys to the parliament. The Dictionary of Subversion is the technical heart of the interception process at the Waihopai station. This sophisticated software functions as an automated filter, scanning millions of private communications in real time for high-value keywords and patterns. Every satellite transmission vacuumed up by the white domes is processed through this digital sieve. It does not wait for a human analyst to identify a threat. It proactively flags data based on a predefined list of terms provided by international partners. This is the industrialization of spying. The dictionary is not looking for criminal activity in the traditional sense. It is looking for diplomatic intent, economic strategies, and political movements that challenge the status quo. The human consequence of this technology is the total loss of privacy for anyone communicating across the Pacific. An email between researchers or a phone call between activists can be automatically intercepted and categorized as intelligence simply because it contains a word on a list they never saw. The GCSB maintains that this is a targeted process, but the sheer volume of data processed proves that the net is cast wide. This software is the engine of a digital occupation, turning the private thoughts and plans of millions into a searchable database for the Five Eyes Alliance. The dictionary ensures that no conversation in the Southern Hemisphere is truly private, as long as the signal passes through the sky above the Waihopai Valley. The NSA handshake represents the deep technical and financial integration between the GCSB and the National Security Agency. This is not a casual cooperation, it is a structural dependency where foreign technology dictates local policy. The hardware inside the Waihopai station, the encryption protocols used to secure the data, and the training of the analysts are all heavily subsidized and directed by the NSA. This relationship creates a power imbalance where the New Zealand government becomes a junior partner in its own defense infrastructure. The financial costs of maintaining such a high-tech facility would be impossible for a nation of 5 million to bear alone, meaning the NSA effectively pays for the privilege of using New Zealand soil as a listening post. This handshake ensures that the priorities of the GCSB are always aligned with the global strategic goals of the United States. It is a form of digital vassalage, where the local agency provides the geographic access and the foreign agency provides the tools of extraction. The investigation reveals that the GCSB often operates as a branch office for the NSA, funneling raw intelligence into the echelon system before it is even reviewed by New Zealand authorities. This technical bond is the most secure part of the digital fortress, a connection that bypasses the democratic process to ensure the flow of data remains uninterrupted. Intercepting the Pacific has become the primary geopolitical role of New Zealand within the Five Eyes Alliance. Because of its unique geographical position, the archipelago acts as a southern ear, monitoring the diplomatic and economic moves of its closest neighbors. This is a profound betrayal of the Pacific family narrative that the government promotes in public. While New Zealand diplomats speak of partnership and aid, the GCSB is actively vacuuming up the communications of Pacific Island leaders, trade negotiators, and regional organizations. This intelligence is not gathered for the protection of New Zealand's borders, it is gathered to give the Five Eyes Alliance an unfair advantage in regional geopolitics. The data harvested from the satellites above Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa is used to map out the influence of rival powers and to monitor the internal stability of these nations. The human cost of this surveillance is the erosion of regional trust. The Pacific neighbors are treated not as allies, but as targets in a high-stakes game of information dominance. New Zealand's role in this system is to be the trusted neighbor that listens at the door. The white domes in the Waihopai Valley are the physical proof of this betrayal, a silent, digital occupation of the Southern Hemisphere executed from the very land that claims to be its sanctuary. The diplomatic betrayal is the most visceral manifestation of the Echelon partnership. Investigative findings have uncovered specific instances where intelligence gathered by the GCSB was used to gain an advantage in international trade and climate negotiations. During high-stakes summits, the communications of foreign delegations were intercepted and analyzed to determine their bottom line before they even reached the bargaining table. This is not national security, it is industrial and diplomatic espionage conducted with state resources. The GCSB has been used to spy on allies and partners alike, providing the Five Eyes alliance with a God view of the global chessboard. The betrayal extends to environmental issues as well. In negotiations over fishing rights and carbon credits, the ability to read the private emails of opposing negotiators allowed the New Zealand government and its partners to stay one step ahead. This turns the concept of international cooperation into a rigged game. The neutral and ethical reputation of the nation is used as a shield to hide a predatory intelligence posture. The investigation proves that the state is willing to sacrifice its moral standing and its diplomatic relationships to fulfill its obligations to the surveillance network. The secrets harvested at Waihopai are the currency that New Zealand uses to buy its way into the inner circle of global power, at the expense of its own integrity and the trust of the world. The sovereignty gap is the final revelation of the Echelon investigation. It is the distance between what the New Zealand public believes their government does and what the GCSB actually does in the service of foreign masters. This gap represents a fundamental erosion of national sovereignty. When the technical infrastructure and the strategic priorities of a nation's primary intelligence agency are dictated by an external alliance, that nation is no longer fully in control of its own destiny. The digital dependency of the GCSB ensures that New Zealand's foreign policy is perpetually anchored to the interests of the Five Eyes. The unseen wonder here is the creation of a state within a state, an agency that operates with its own budget, its own secrets, and its own loyalties, largely shielded from the oversight of the Parliament and the people. The archipelago has been transformed into a geographic utility for a global surveillance machine. The sovereignty of the soil has been traded for a seat in a digital bunker. This investigation proves that the Pure New Zealand brand is not just a mask for historical crimes, but a cover for a modern, ongoing betrayal. As we move from the digital signals of the South to the physical bunkers of the High Country, we see that the state's preparation for a global collapse is the ultimate expression of this sovereignty gap. The nation is being prepared as an escape pod for the very elite who built the systems of surveillance we have just uncovered. The 2013 GCSB breach remains the definitive moment, and the mask of the New Zealand intelligence apparatus was forcibly removed. For years, the public was led to believe that the Government Communications Security Bureau was a shield pointed outward, a specialized agency focused solely on foreign threats and high-level global signals. However, a series of internal failures and legal challenges revealed that the agency had been systematically and illegally monitoring its own people. This was not a localized error or a single rogue analyst. It was a systemic breach of the very laws designed to protect the domestic population from state overreach. The investigation uncovered that at least 88 New Zealand residents had been subjected to unlawful surveillance over several years. This revelation shattered the comfortable illusion of domestic privacy that the national brand had marketed so successfully. It proved that the digital nets cast from the Waihopai Valley were not just vacuuming up foreign data, but were being dragged across the private lives of local citizens. The state had turned its most powerful tools of war against the people it was sworn to protect, demonstrating that in the eyes of the intelligence community, there is no such thing as a safe boundary. The GCSB breach was the forensic proof of an invisible occupation, where the sanctuary of the South Pacific was exposed as one of the most monitored patches of Earth in the Southern Hemisphere. The .com precedent serves as a chilling forensic case study in how the state can repurpose global anti-terror resources to target a private resident for corporate interests. In 2012, an elite tactical police unit raided the rural estate of Kim.com, a German-born entrepreneur living in New Zealand. While the visuals of the raid were dramatic, the real investigative story was happening in the digital shadows. It was later proven that the GCSB had illegally spied on .com to facilitate the operation, acting on behalf of foreign authorities and commercial entities. This case exposed the blurred lines between national security and the protection of international copyright holders. The state used the Echelon Network and the Five Eyes partnership to treat a local immigration matter as a high-level security threat. The .com raid was the first time many New Zealanders realized that their government was willing to bypass its own laws to satisfy the demands of its more powerful intelligence partners. It set a dangerous precedent. If you are perceived as a threat to the global economic order, the neutral sanctuary of New Zealand will not protect you. The state's willingness to deploy military-grade surveillance against a domestic target proved that the GCSB had become an unaccountable power, operating within a gray zone where the rights of the individual are secondary to the technical requirements of the alliance. The legislative retropurposing that followed the 2013 scandal was a masterclass in political damage control and the formalization of the surveillance state. Instead of reining in the GCSB after its illegal activities were exposed, the government moved with unprecedented speed to change the law. The Government Communications Security Bureau Amendment Act was pushed through the Parliament, effectively legalizing the very spying activities that had just been proven unlawful. This was a cold, administrative move to ensure that the agency would never again be caught on the wrong side of the statute. The new legislation granted the GCSB the power to assist other domestic agencies, such as the police and the Security Intelligence Service, in monitoring New Zealanders. This turned a foreign signals agency into a central hub for domestic surveillance. The government argued that these changes were necessary for national safety in an increasingly digital world, but the investigative reality was that the state was simply moving the goalposts to protect itself from future litigation. The law was no longer a shield for the citizen, it had been repurposed into a tool for the state to maintain its digital occupation. This legislative shift ensured that the invisible net was not only permanent but also officially sanctioned, closing the loop on a system where the state is allowed to watch its people as long as it writes the rules itself. The whistleblower's toll reveals the human cost for those within the intelligence system who attempted to flag the increasing overreach. Behind the secure walls of the GCSB and the GCSB's oversight offices, a handful of individuals recognized that the agency was drifting into illegal waters. These were not radicals, they were professionals who believed in the rule of law. However, the state's internal security protocols are designed to neutralize dissent before it reaches the public ear. Those who questioned the legality of the domestic monitoring found themselves marginalized, subjected to internal investigations, or forced out of their careers. The security in the agency's title also applies to its ability to secure its own secrets from internal scrutiny. The human consequence of this culture is a profound chilling effect on anyone within the bureaucracy who might wish to speak the truth. The state has created a system where loyalty to the agency is equated with loyalty to the nation, making any act of whistleblowing look like a betrayal of the collective safety. This ensures that the true scale of the surveillance remains a secret, protected by a wall of institutional fear. The investigation into the 2013 scandal gave us a glimpse of the truth, but it also showed how effectively the state can silence those who try to tell it. The invisible occupation is maintained not just by technology, but by the systematic suppression of the human conscience within the machine. Metadata has been weaponized by the GCSB to create a searchable archive of the digital lives of every person in the country. While the state often argues that it is not reading your emails, it is consistently collecting bulk metadata, the records of who you call, when you call them, where you are when you send a message, and which websites you visit. In the world of modern intelligence, metadata is often more valuable than the content of a conversation. It allows the state to map out your entire social network, your political leanings, your movements, and your daily habits. Under the Five Eyes protocols, this metadata is not just stored locally, it is funneled into the global databases of the NSA and other partners. This means that a citizen in Auckland or Christchurch is having their digital footprint archived in a foreign data center for potential future analysis. This is the reality of bulk collection. The state treats the entire population as a pool of potential suspects rather than a community of private individuals. The investigation proves that the digital fortress is not just about catching terrorists, it is about maintaining a God view of the citizenry. The state has turned the internet, the very tool that was supposed to liberate information, into the primary mechanism of its own surveillance, proving that the digital occupation is as all-encompassing as it is silent. The sanctuary paradox is the final revelation of the domestic surveillance investigation. It is the contradiction of a nation that markets itself as the safest, most off-the-grid place on Earth, while simultaneously building one of the most technologically integrated listening posts in existence. The New Zealand government has used the global desire for a safe haven to mask the reality that it is a leader in digital monitoring. This paradox is a powerful tool for the state. The more the world believes New Zealand is a peaceful sanctuary, the less they look for the geodesic domes and the legislative fences. The invisible occupation is the true cost of the national brand. We have been told we are safe in this paradise, but we are only safe as long as we do not challenge the state's right to watch us. The investigation proves that the unseen wonders of the landscape are now being matched by the unseen wonders of the digital state, a system that monitors the horizon for threats while keeping a constant, cold eye on its own people. This domestic reality is the foundation for what comes next. As the state secures the digital landscape, the global elite are securing the physical one. We are moving from the invisible signals of the GCSB to the literal bunkers of the high country, where the sanctuary is being hollowed out for the 0.1%. The secret granting of citizenship to Peter Thiel in 2011 serves as the definitive forensic proof that the New Zealand passport has a price tag for the global elite. While thousands of immigrants spend years navigating a rigid point system, living in the country for a mandatory 1,350 days to prove their commitment, Thiel was granted full rights of a citizen in total silence. This was achieved through the Exceptional Circumstances Clause, a legal mechanism that allows the Minister of Internal Affairs to waive every residency requirement if the applicant is deemed to provide a significant benefit to the nation. This was not a democratic decision, it was a high-level administrative bypass that remained hidden from the public for 6 years. The investigation into this exceptional clause reveals a parallel legal reality where the rules of the border do not apply to the architects of the digital age. The state argued that Thiel's wealth and tech sector influence were a benefit that outweighed the need for him to actually live on the soil he now technically co-owns. This case shattered the national myth of egalitarianism, proving that the sanctuary brand is built on a tiered system of belonging. The soil is a shared heritage for the many, but it is a purchasable asset for the few who can afford to bypass the gatekeepers. A forensic analysis of Peter Till's movements reveals that his commitment to the New Zealand nation consisted of just 4 brief trips totaling 12 days. These 288 hours were valued by the state above a lifetime of local contribution, tax-paying, and community building by ordinary residents. This is the 12-day citizenship, a transaction where the physical reality of the land was secondary to the financial potential of the applicant. To the colonial government, Till was not a person to be integrated into a culture, but a high-value asset to be secured. Those 12 days in paradise were enough to grant him the power to purchase protected land that is legally off-limits to most foreign buyers. This is the core of the exceptional circumstances scandal. It proved that the state views the archipelago as a commodity. The investigation into his travel logs shows a pattern of someone checking on an investment rather than someone seeking a home. Yet, the state-sponsored narrative continues to claim that the citizenship process is fair and robust. The reality is that the Southern Alps have become a high-altitude waiting room for the 0.1%, where the price of a lifeboat is a multi-million-dollar check and a handful of days spent in a luxury lodge. The acquisition of the 193-hectare Damper Bay estate on the shores of Lake Wanaka marks the transition from agricultural heritage to a billionaire land grab. This territory was once part of the working landscape of the South Island, but under Till's ownership, it was reclassified to suit the needs of a private fortress. The state's role in this transition was pivotal. By granting citizenship, they removed the oversight of the Overseas Investment Office, allowing the sale to proceed without the usual public interest tests. This is how outstanding natural landscapes are privatized. The high-altitude plains are being carved up into massive, secluded holdings where the public is physically and legally excluded. The investigation into the Damper Bay purchase reveals a pattern of territorial consolidation where the global elite are buying up the very wilderness that the state has spent a century emptying of its indigenous people. The irony is visceral. The Ngatiwai were cleared from Hatura to create a sanctuary for birds, but the billionaires are cleared into Wanaka to create a sanctuary for themselves. The geography of the South Island is being terraformed into an exclusive escape pod, where the beauty of the landscape is used as a natural wall to keep the rest of the world at a distance. The architecture of anxiety is best exemplified by the Second Star Lodge proposal, a massive, 330-meter-long bunker-like structure designed to be embedded into the hills of Damper Bay. This was not a home, it was a techno-Xanadu designed to withstand global social disintegration. While the local planning committees eventually rejected the specific visual impact of the lodge, the intent behind it remains a clear signal of the billionaire mindset. These estates are being built with subterranean levels, independent power grids, and high-security perimeters that function as self-sustaining lifeboats. The investigation into these building plans reveals a deep distrust of the future. The elite who have profited most from the digital occupation of the world are now using those profits to buy a physical exit from the consequences. They are not coming to New Zealand to join a community, they are coming to survive the collapse of the communities they helped disrupt. The Southern Alps have become the ultimate insurance policy, a place where the 0.1% can retreat to a pristine void while the rest of the world deals with the fallout of the systems they designed. The Second Star is a monument to this fear, a high-tech fortress hidden in the folds of a natural wonder, proving that the sanctuary is being hollowed out to serve as a bunker for the few. The transition from the Teal scandal to the modern, active Investor Plus visa shows how the state has codified the golden ticket economy. The price of a sanctuary is no longer a secret administrative favor, it is a multi-million-dollar entry on a public ledger. To secure a pathway to residency, an investor must now commit at least 15 million New Zealand dollars into state-approved assets. This is the industrialization of the escape pod. The government has turned a national identity into a financial product, marketing the safety and isolation of the islands to a global market of wealthy individuals looking for a hedge against instability. The investigation into this visa category reveals that the state is actively competing with other safe haven nations to attract the world's most mobile capital. This economic strategy ensures that the South Island will continue to be partitioned into private estates for the global elite. The unseen wonder, here is the sheer scale of the wealth flowing into these valleys, a tide of capital that drives up local land prices and forces the resident population further into the margins. The state-sponsored brand of Pure New Zealand is now the primary marketing tool for a real estate scheme that values a billionaire's bank account more than a citizen's belonging. The billionaire land purchases in Queenstown and Wanaka represent the final realization of the last lifeboat strategy. This is why the world's elite view the South Island as the ultimate insurance policy. Its geographic isolation, its green reputation, and its sophisticated surveillance state make it the perfect location for a managed retreat. The investigation has come full circle, from the buried terraces of 1886 to the digital domes of Waihopai and the high-altitude bunkers of the present. We have uncovered a nation that is being prepared as a sanctuary for those who can afford the gate fee. The unseen wonders of the landscape are the physical and digital walls built to protect the interests of the state and its international partners. The Pure New Zealand brand is the mask that hides the historical crimes of erasure and the modern realities of exclusion. The archipelago is not a prehistoric void, it is a highly managed, technologically integrated, and increasingly privatized territory. The silence of the forests and the stillness of the lakes are the products of a long history of removal and a current strategy of containment. As we stand on the shores of Lake Wanaka, we see the true face of the hidden region, a land where the truth is kept underwater, the people are kept behind a legal fence, and the future is being reserved for those who hold the golden ticket. The investigation is complete, but the occupation continues in silence. The surge in council applications for ancillary residential storage and oversized wine cellars in the Queenstown Lakes district masks a deeper, more calculated reality. A forensic examination of these architectural blueprints reveals a recurring pattern: reinforced concrete walls, specialized blast door specifications, and air filtration systems that far exceed the requirements for storing vintage Pinot Noir. These are not basements, they are hardened subterranean living quarters designed for long-term isolation. The state-sponsored planning process allows these structures to be buried beneath the surface of legitimate domestic architecture, effectively hiding the scale of the Hollow Mountains from public record. To the casual observer, these estates are merely luxury homes, but the volume of excavated soil tells a different story. The sheer amount of earth being moved in valleys like Speargrass Flat suggests the creation of entire underground complexes. By classifying these bunkers as utilities or basements, the global elite can bypass the more rigorous public notifications required for major infrastructure. This is the first layer of subterranean paranoia, a massive, private construction project that uses the language of domesticity to shield a survivalist reality. The mountains are being hollowed out in silence, creating a hidden geography of retreat that is visible only to those who know how to read the engineering specifications buried in the local archives. The technical contradiction of building deep earth bunkers in one of the most seismically active zones on the planet is perhaps the most revealing aspect of this investigation. The Southern Alps sit directly atop the Alpine Fault, a geological boundary capable of producing a magnitude 8.0 earthquake at any moment. Why would the architects of the digital age choose to bury themselves in a landscape of such profound instability? The answer lies in the specific engineering of these bunkers, which are designed to be geologically decoupled from the surrounding rock. They are not merely holes in the ground, they are sophisticated, shock-absorbed capsules capable of floating within the soil. This level of geologic defiance proves that these structures are not a reaction to local natural disasters, but a preparation for a global social collapse where the stability of the state is the primary concern. The billionaire class is not afraid of the earth moving, they are afraid of the people moving. They have calculated that the geographic isolation of the South Island provides a better defensive barrier than any stable tectonic plate in the Northern Hemisphere. The risk of an earthquake is a price they are willing to pay for a sanctuary that is thousands of miles away from the centers of global unrest. This choice reveals the depth of their paranoia, a belief that a fractured landscape is safer than a fractured society. The supply chain of secrecy required to build these bunkers is a global operation that bypasses the local economy. For the most sensitive stages of construction, specialized international contractors are flown into the country on private manifests. These are experts in high-grade nuclear, biological, and chemical filtration, as well as off-grid power generation and hydroponic life support systems. They arrive with their own equipment and their own protocols, ensuring that the most advanced features of the escape pod remain invisible to local eyes. This is a forensic signature of the 0.1%, a construction process that treats the local population as a potential security leak. While the primary structural work might be done by New Zealand firms, the internal, nervous system, of the bunker is installed by a shadow workforce that answers to no local authority. This ensures that even the people who built the house do not know the full capacity of the space beneath it. The state-sponsored border controls are often waived or expedited for these technical consultants, further proving the existence of a parallel legal track for the billionaire class. The mountains are being hollowed out by a ghost workforce, creating a subterranean world that is technically and culturally isolated from the land it occupies. This is not a local development, it is an international occupation of the deep earth. Council records for utility upgrades in Wanaka and Glenorchy reveal a massive discrepancy between the stated needs of a luxury vacation home and the actual capacity of the installed systems. A 5-bedroom house does not require an industrial-scale water purification plant or a battery array capable of powering a small hospital for 6 months. These upgrades are the survivalist ledger of the elite, a documented record of their preparations for a total breakdown of public infrastructure. The investigation into these permits shows that the state is fully aware of the scale of this subterranean network but chooses to treat it as a series of private, disconnected improvements. By allowing these massive power and water redundancies to be classified as residential extras, the government avoids having to address the broader implications of a wealthy class that has effectively opted out of the national grid. This is a cold, administrative acceptance of a fragmented future. The state is not just allowing these bunkers to be built, it is providing the legal framework to ensure they remain functional when the public systems fail. The survivalist ledger proves that the sanctuary is being partitioned into self-sustaining cells, where the safety of the individual is guaranteed by the depth of their private resources rather than the strength of the collective contract. The local contractors and laborers who are permitted to work on these estates exist within a gated valley of silence. Every plumber, electrician, and carpenter is required to sign highly restrictive non-disclosure agreements that carry significant financial and legal penalties. They are prohibited from taking photographs, discussing the dimensions of the excavations, or even naming their employers. This creates a culture of forced ignorance where the people who live in the region are prevented from understanding the true nature of the landscape they are building. The human cost of this secrecy is a profound sense of alienation. The workers are building a future that they are explicitly excluded from. They are the hands that hollow out the mountains, but they will be the first ones kept on the outside of the blast doors when the situation changes. The state-sponsored privacy laws are weaponized here to protect the strategic interests of the property owners over the transparency of the community. This gated valley of information ensures that the hollow mountains remain a myth to most, even as the truckloads of concrete and steel continue to roll into the high country. The silence of the workers is the final layer of the bunker's defense, a human barrier designed to ensure that the ultimate retreat remains an unseen wonder until the moment it is needed. The final redaction in the investigation of these subterranean fortresses is the realization that they are the physical extension of the digital surveillance state. The same elite who benefit from the interception at Waihopai and the bulk collection of the GCSB are the ones hollowing out the mountains of the South Island. The shadows in the south are both digital and physical. The bunkers are equipped with their own dedicated satellite links and encrypted communication nodes, ensuring that the 0.1% remain connected to the global intelligence network even after the public internet is severed. This is the closing of the loop. The state provides the surveillance to monitor the masses, and the mountains provide the physical shelter for the architects of that monitoring. The South Island is the chosen ground because it offers the perfect combination of geographic isolation and technological integration. The Pure New Zealand brand serves as the ultimate distraction, a postcard of nature that masks a landscape of extreme fortification. The investigation into the unseen wonders has revealed a nation that is being prepared as a high-tech lifeboat for a global elite who have no intention of going down with the ship. The Hollow Mountains are the end point of a long history of erasure and exclusion, a final, subterranean redoubt where the truth of the land is buried beneath the mud and the rock, protected by a state that has turned its back on its own people. The shadow workforce of the Queenstown Lakes District represents the invisible biological fuel that keeps the billionaire estates and the tourism machine functioning. These are the cleaners, the cooks, and the technicians who spend their daylight hours maintaining the high-altitude fortresses of the global elite, only to be forced into the margins of the landscape once their shifts are over. Because the local property market has been cannibalized by international capital, these essential workers have been priced out of the very geography they serve. They exist in a state of permanent displacement, sleeping in unheated vans or modified trucks parked on the gravel outskirts of the town. This is the human consequence of the sanctuary brand. The state has prioritized the arrival of the 0.1% while ignoring the housing needs of the people who actually operate the infrastructure. This creates a parasitic relationship where the luxury of the few is built directly upon the precarity of the many. The investigation into this workforce reveals a deep, structural inequality that is hidden behind the postcard aesthetics of the region. These workers are the unseen inhabitants of the paradise, moving through the town like ghosts, their presence tolerated only as long as they are facilitating the comfort of the wealthy. The contrast between the marble floors they scrub during the day and the frozen metal floors they sleep on at night is the most visceral proof that the social contract in this archipelago has been fundamentally broken. The luxury displacement in the Southern Alps is a forensic case study in how global capital can decouple a local housing market from the reality of local wages. The influx of active investor visas and the billionaire land grab have turned the Queenstown Lakes District into a financial asset class rather than a community. When a single estate is sold for $50 million, the surrounding property values are pulled upward into a stratosphere that no local teacher, nurse, or hospitality worker can ever hope to reach. This is not a natural market evolution, it is a state-sanctioned economic clearance. By facilitating the arrival of the world's most mobile wealth, the government has effectively engineered the removal of its own middle and working classes from the high country. The local rental market has been swallowed by short-term vacation platforms, leaving the resident population with nowhere to turn. This displacement is the modern version of the 19th century clearances, a process where the unproductive locals are moved out to make room for a more profitable use of the land. The investigation into these property records reveals a landscape that is no longer owned by the people who live in it, but by a global elite who view the soil as an insurance policy. The result is a fractured society where the wonder of the location is a luxury that the people who maintain it can no longer afford to consume. The van life mirage is a strategic branding exercise that masks a grim survivalist reality. On social media, living in a vehicle is marketed as a choice for the adventurous and the free, but for the workers in the shadow of the Alps, it is a desperate response to a housing catastrophe. There is no adventure in a sub-zero alpine night when the condensation freezes on the inside of your windshield. The investigation into these parking lots reveals a hidden population of professionals, managers, builders, and paramedics, who are living in conditions that the state would never tolerate in a traditional dwelling. This is the adventure brand being used as a shield to hide the state's failure to provide basic infrastructure. By framing homelessness as a lifestyle choice, the government avoids the political and financial accountability of the crisis. These workers are the hidden homeless, forced to navigate a maze of council regulations that prohibit them from staying in one place for too long, effectively turning them into internal refugees in their own country. The psychological toll of this instability is immense. To keep the paradise functioning, these people must pretend that their precarity is a form of freedom. The reality is that the wilderness has been repurposed as a dormitory for a workforce that has been stripped of its dignity to protect the property values of the elite. The rise of the corporate dormitory and the practice of hotbedding represent the absolute limit of the housing crisis in the South Island. In the crowded rental units of Queenstown and Wanaka, living rooms have been partitioned into multi-shift barracks where the beds never get cold. A worker coming off a night shift at a luxury lodge will climb into a bed just vacated by a cleaner starting their morning shift. This is the industrialization of human rest. The state's failure to enforce housing standards or to provide affordable alternatives has turned the domestic life of the workforce into a high-density, low-quality commercial operation. The investigation into these properties reveals a level of overcrowding that is systematically ignored by the local authorities because, without these dormitories, the tourism economy would collapse overnight. The paradise relies on this hidden density to maintain its 5-star service levels. The human cost of this system is the total loss of privacy and stability for the people who are the backbone of the region. They are living in conditions that are diametrically opposed to the pristine and spacious image that the government promotes to the world. The corporate dormitory is the dark counterpart to the billionaire bunker. While the elite build for total isolation, the workers are forced into a total lack of it. The invisible boundary between the $50 million escape pod and the gravel parking lot is a psychological fault line that defines the daily experience of the local worker. Every day, these people cross into a world of extreme fortification, climate-controlled comfort, and subterranean luxury. They see the backup power grids, the high-grade filtration systems, and the imported marble of the bunkers. They are the ones who test the security systems and stock the pantries with gourmet goods. Then, at the end of the day, they cross back over the boundary to a vehicle where they must ration their propane and worry about being moved on by the police. This constant movement between two extremes creates a profound sense of alienation and resentment. The worker is reminded every hour of exactly what their labor is protecting, a sanctuary for a global elite who have no intention of sharing their safety. The investigation proves that the safe haven is not for everyone. It is a partitioned geography where the walls are not just made of concrete, but of economic exclusion. The psychological toll of maintaining someone else's survivalist dream while being unable to secure your own basic needs is the ultimate hidden cost of the sanctuary model. The unseen wonder here is the resilience of a workforce that continues to function in a system that has clearly abandoned them. The fractured social contract in the Southern Alps is the final human revelation of this investigation. It represents a total breakdown of the idea that hard work and community contribution will lead to a stable life in the sanctuary. By prioritizing the billionaire escape pod and the digital fortress over the basic human needs of its residents, the New Zealand state has fundamentally changed the nature of the archipelago. The South Island is no longer a shared home, it is a tiered asset. The plight of the local worker is the natural conclusion of a century of erasure and exclusion. From the removal of the Ngati Y to the hollowing out of the mountains for the 0.1%, the pattern is the same: the land is cleared of its people to make room for a more valuable narrative. The sanctuary has become a site of extreme inequality, where the beauty of the landscape is a weapon used to justify the displacement of those who cannot pay the entry fee. As we close this investigation into the two-tier paradise, we see that the most important features of this country are not the mountains or the lakes, but the walls, both physical and digital, that have been built to divide the winners from the losers. The hidden regions are not just geographical locations, they are the people who have been pushed into the shadows so that the brand can continue to shine for the world's elite. The anatomy of a ghost town is best understood through the forensic remains of a community that was discarded the moment its economic utility vanished. In 1951, the Blackwater mine at Waiuta suffered a catastrophic shaft collapse, and within hours, the state-sanctioned engine of extraction simply ceased to exist. Families who had lived there for generations were given mere days to pack their lives before the town was struck from the official map. This was not a natural decline, it was a clinical amputation. Walking through the remnants of the foundations today, you see more than just rotted timber and rusted, corrugated iron. You see the physical proof of a state that views human settlements as temporary fuel for an industrial fire. The town was built on a single, narrow premise: the extraction of gold from the quartz reefs deep beneath the Grey District. When the gold could no longer be reached, the people became a liability. This sudden abandonment left behind a hollowed-out landscape where the silence is a witness to a profound social betrayal. The state didn't just leave a town, it left a vacuum of accountability, moving its focus to the next profitable reef while the families of Waiuta were scattered into the winds of the west coast. This is the first layer of the ghost of Waiuta, the realization that in the eyes of the early industrial state, a community is only as valuable as the minerals it can pull from the dark. The arsenic footprint at Waiuta is the invisible chemical legacy of roasted arsenopyrite that continues to saturate the west coast soil. During the peak of the gold extraction process, the ore was crushed and roasted at extreme temperatures to release the trapped wealth. This process didn't just produce gold, it released tons of arsenic trioxide into the atmosphere and the surrounding landscape. For decades, the white dust of the roasting furnaces settled over the gardens, the schools, and the water tanks of the town. Today, the processing sands that remain at the site are a concentrated toxic archive. These tailings are not just sand, they are a forensic signature of an era when environmental safety was non-existent. The arsenic does not disappear, it migrates through the groundwater and stays locked in the upper layers of the soil, waiting to be disturbed. The investigation into these sands reveals levels of contamination that would trigger a national emergency in any modern urban center, yet here, they are treated as a historical curiosity. The state-sponsored narrative of a clean landscape ignores the reality that the foundations of the West Coast's wealth were laid with some of the most potent toxins known to man. The arsenic footprint is a permanent scar on the geography, a silent poison that remains long after the last miner has left the mountain. Examining the rusted infrastructure of the leaching plants reveals how the state's early industrial engine used cyanide to extract the final grains of wealth from the crushed rock. This was the pinnacle of 20th century extraction, the use of deadly chemical solutions to dissolve gold from the waste. The vats where this process took place still sit in the forest, their metal skins corroding into the earth. This wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a high-stakes gamble with the local ecology. The cyanide leaching process was efficient, but it left behind a toxic slurry that was often dumped into the nearest creek or stored in unlined pits. The investigation into the drainage patterns around Wayuta shows a history of chemical runoff that has likely altered the biology of the surrounding waterways for a century. The state allowed this because the gold was seen as a national necessity, a way to fund the development of the growing country. The unseen wonder here is the sheer scale of the toxicity that was normalized in the name of progress. The rusted vats are monuments to a period of industrial desperation, where the long-term health of the soil and the water was traded for a short-term boost in the treasury. The cyanide was the final tool of the extraction machine, ensuring that not a single speck of gold was left behind, regardless of the chemical cost to the future. The human cost for the families who stayed behind after the collapse is the most tragic chapter of the Wayuta investigation. For decades after the mine closed, a handful of people continued to live among the tailings, breathing the dust of a poisoned industrial heritage. These were the discarded miners and their descendants, people who had no other place to go and whose health was never monitored by the state that had profited from their labor. The chronic exposure to arsenic and other heavy metals didn't manifest as a sudden crisis, it was a slow, generational erosion of health. Respiratory issues, skin conditions, and early deaths were common in the mining families of the West Coast, yet these were framed as the natural hazards of a hard life rather than the result of a managed environmental catastrophe. The state's failure to conduct long-term health studies in these ghost towns is a tactical silence. By not looking for the evidence of harm, the government avoids the legal and moral responsibility of the cleanup. The people of Wayuta were treated as disposable components of the mine, used until they were broken and then left to live in the wreckage. Connecting these human stories to the chemical data reveals a pattern of profound neglect, a state that extracted the gold from the ground and the life from its workers, leaving only the poisoned relics behind as a reminder of the debt. The state's amnesia regarding Wayuta is a necessary component of the modern, Green New Zealand brand. To market the archipelago as a pristine sanctuary, the government must actively manage the memory of its early industrial crimes. The environmental wreckage of the gold mines is often hidden behind the rapid growth of the native bush or framed as a heritage site for tourists to visit. This rebranding of a toxic landscape into a scenic ruin is a masterful exercise in narrative control. By treating Wayuta as a museum of a bygone era, the state avoids discussing the ongoing contamination that still leaches into the West Coast rivers. This amnesia is not accidental, it is a structural requirement for the pure brand. If the public were to understand the true scale of the arsenic and cyanide legacy, the image of the country as an untouched paradise would collapse. The investigation into the poisoned relics proves that the state is more interested in managing the aesthetics of the land than its health. The ghost of Wayuta is not just a town that died, it is a truth that is being buried. As we close this chapter on the industrial engine of the past, we see how the same state-sponsored strategies of erasure are being used in the present to hide the digital occupation and the billionaire retreat. The poison of the past is the precursor to the exclusion of the future. The administrative erasure of mining townships functions as a clinical deletion of human presence from the official record. When the revenue streams from the quartz reefs of the West Coast ceased to flow, the state did not merely withdraw its funding, it effectively orphaned the resident families by striking their homes from the national map. This was a tactical retreat. By removing the legal status of these settlements, the government absolved itself of the responsibility to maintain roads, schools, and health infrastructure. This process of desertification turned a living community into a legal void. The investigation into the gazetted records of the 1950s reveals a cold, bureaucratic finality where the lives of thousands were reduced to a line item that was no longer profitable. The state-sponsored narrative frames this as a natural consequence of resource depletion, but the forensic reality is a forced displacement. The families who remained were treated as statistical noise, biological remnants of an industrial engine that had moved elsewhere. This erasure is the first layer of the disposable people model, the realization that the state's commitment to its citizens is entirely dependent on the value of the ground beneath their feet. Once the gold was gone, the people were deleted, leaving behind a geography of orphans who were forced to navigate a landscape that the government no longer officially recognized as inhabited. The scenery as a mask is a sophisticated ecological strategy used by the state to cover the physical scars of industrial failure. In the high rainfall environment of the West Coast, native vegetation grows with a speed that quickly hides the rotted timber and rusted machinery of the mines. The government utilizes this natural growth to prioritize the pristine brand over the actual remediation of the soil. By allowing the bush to reclaim the ruins, the state creates an aesthetic of untouched wilderness that effectively hides the toxic tailings beneath a layer of green. This is a visual deception. The investigation into the soil profiles of these scenic reserves reveals that the arsenic and cyanide from the early industrial era are still present, locked under a thin canopy of ferns and moss. The state-sponsored tourism model relies on this mask to sell the archipelago as an environmental sanctuary, even while the heavy metals continue to leach into the waterways. This preference for aesthetics over health is a recurring theme in the national identity. The scenery is not a sign of a healing ecosystem, it is a permanent redaction of the truth. By framing these poison sites as nature, the state ensures that the public never asks about the chemical debt left behind by the companies that built the early economy of the nation. The toxic inheritance is the generational health struggle of the West Coast communities who were left to live in the wreckage of the state's industrial engine. When the mines closed and the towns were erased, the chemical tailings did not disappear. They became the foundational soil of the gardens and the play areas of the families who stayed. This is a forensic history written in the biology of the residents. Chronic exposure to the roasted arsenic dust and the chemical runoff from the leaching plants has created a legacy of respiratory issues and early mortality that the state has systematically ignored. The investigation into the regional health data shows a pattern of neglect where the symptoms of industrial poisoning are often misidentified as the results of a harsh lifestyle. By failing to conduct comprehensive longitudinal studies, the government maintains a state of plausible deniability. The families are left to bear the physical cost of the gold that funded the development of the cities. This inheritance is the dark reality of the safe haven myth. The people who were once the primary drivers of the nation's wealth have been abandoned to a landscape of permanent contamination, their health treated as a secondary concern to the preservation of the green image that the state presents to the world. A forensic link exists between the abandoned miners of the past and the van life service workers of the present, revealing a parallel precarity that defines the New Zealand social contract. Both groups are treated by the state as temporary biological fuel, necessary for the extraction of wealth but entirely disposable once their utility is exhausted. Just as the miners were cleared from the mountains when the gold ran dry, the modern cleaners, cooks, and technicians are being cleared from the South Island's luxury zones by a housing market they can no longer afford. The disposable people of the 21st century live in vehicles in the shadow of the very estates they maintain, existing in a state of legal and physical instability that mirrors the ghost towns of the West Coast. The investigation proves that the state has not changed its fundamental posture, it has merely shifted its focus from mineral extraction to the extraction of global capital. The workers are required to facilitate the paradise for the elite, but they are denied a permanent place within it. This cycle of use and discard is the engine of the national economy. Whether it is gold or tourism, the result for the labor force is the same, a life of precarity in a landscape that values the scenery more than the people who make it function. The perpetual cycle of removal is the ultimate investigative synthesis of the New Zealand sanctuary model. This state-sponsored narrative requires the ongoing removal of the working class and the indigenous population to maintain a high-value aesthetic for the global elite. From the 19th century clearances of the Ngati to the modern displacement of the service workers in Queenstown, the pattern is one of systemic exclusion. The land is continuously cleaned of its human history and its social complexity to be sold as a pristine, prehistoric void. This is the final layer of the unseen wonders, the realization that the sanctuary is a partitioned geography where the walls are built to protect the winners from the losers. The state has successfully turned the entire archipelago into a tiered asset, where the permanent scenery is a luxury product reserved for those who hold the golden ticket. The families of Waiuta and the Vandwellers of Wanaka are the collateral damage of this brand. They are the evidence of a nation that has traded its community for a seat in a digital bunker. The investigation is now complete. The hidden regions are not just places on a map, but the lives of the people who have been pushed into the shadows so the elite can enjoy the view in silence. The mountains are hollow, the soil is poisoned, and the sanctuary is a cage. The final transformation of the landscape into a managed theme park functions as a clinical curation of reality, where the wilderness is no longer a natural state but a state-governed simulation. The government has spent a century removing the human fingerprints of the original inhabitants and the industrial workers to create a high-definition product for global consumption. This is a forensic reconstruction of a prehistoric void. Every ridge, valley, and lake is managed to fit a specific aesthetic profile that suggests an untouched paradise, while in reality, it is one of the most technologically monitored and legally restricted territories on Earth. The investigation reveals that nature we are sold as a digital asset, a visual mask that hides the infrastructure of the surveillance state and the billionaire bunkers. This managed environment is designed to be consumed as a luxury experience, stripped of its difficult histories and its chemical debts. The state-sponsored brand of Pure New Zealand is the operating system for this theme park, a set of rules that dictate what is seen and what is redacted. The result is a geography that feels like a dream but functions like a prison for the truth. The mountains are not wild, they are sets. The forests are not ancient, they are plantations of memory. This is the first layer of the Vatican of the Pacific, the realization that the land has been turned into a high-stakes simulation where the presence of the real people is treated as a flaw in the code. The paywall of paradise represents the final economic enclosure of the national parks and ancestral lands, turning them into exclusive enclaves for global capital. The state has moved beyond simple conservation and into the territory of high-value asset management. By implementing restrictive permit systems, exorbitant active investor visas, and luxury-only access to remote regions, the government has effectively placed the most significant parts of the archipelago behind a financial barrier. The people whose ancestors named these mountains and the families who built the early infrastructure are now legally and economically excluded from the soil. This is a forensic shift in ownership. The sanctuary is no longer a shared public good, it is a premium product reserved for those who can afford the gate fee. The investigation into the regional economy shows a landscape where the cost of entry is designed to filter out the resident population, leaving the wilderness to the 0.1%. This paywall is the mechanism of a modern clearance, a way to ensure that the managed theme park remains a private retreat for the winners of the global economy. The beauty of the South Island has been weaponized to justify this exclusion, creating a partitioned geography where the natural wonders are only accessible to those who hold the golden ticket. This is the financial architecture of the Vatican of the Pacific, a land where the spiritual and physical heart of the nation has been sold to the highest bidder. Analyzing the 4K marketing of the national brand reveals how high-definition aesthetics function as a digital shroud to actively suppress the histories of displacement and industrial poisoning. The state uses the visual power of the landscape to overwhelm the investigative curiosity of the public. When every image of the country is a saturated, aerial masterpiece of pristine nature, the mind is conditioned to stop looking for the toxic tailings of Wyuta or the hidden homeless of Queenstown. This is the aesthetic redaction, a strategic use of beauty to drown out the truth. The investigation proves that the more the government promotes the 4K image of the islands, the more it is hiding the structural inequality and the chemical debts beneath the surface. This marketing is not a celebration of the land, it is a tool of erasure. It buries the losers of history under a layer of cinematic gloss, ensuring that the global elite can enjoy the sanctuary without having to confront the human cost of its creation. The 4K aesthetics are the final coat of paint on a geography of exclusion, a way to make the hollowing out of the mountains and the digital occupation of the Pacific look like an environmental triumph. The brand is the most powerful weapon in the state's arsenal, a visual filter that prevents the world from seeing the archipelago as anything other than a prehistoric void. The South Island has evolved into a modern Vatican, a sovereign-like territory where the 0.1% exist outside the social and legal constraints that govern the resident population. This elite enclosure is the ultimate goal of the escape pod strategy. Through citizenship by investment schemes and exceptional circumstances clauses, the billionaire class has secured a geography where they are the primary stakeholders. They do not live under the same rules of residency, property oversight, or public accountability as the people who maintain their estates. This is a state within a state. The investigation into the high-altitude plains of Wanaka and Queenstown reveals a landscape that has been functionally severed from the rest of the nation. The bunkers, the private security perimeters, and the dedicated satellite links are the infrastructure of a parallel sovereignty. In this Vatican of the Pacific, the global elite are the high priests of a new order, protected by the mountains and the surveillance state from the consequences of the systems they helped build elsewhere. The resident population is tolerated only as a service class, a temporary biological fuel that exists on the periphery of the sanctuary. This enclosure is the final realization of the hidden region, a territory that has been cleared of its people and its history to serve as a private redoubt for the architects of the digital age. The final redaction in this investigation is the synthesis of the physical bunkers, the digital surveillance, and the social clearances into a single, inescapable conclusion: the sanctuary is not for you. Every discovery we have made, from the buried terraces of 1886 to the white domes of Waihopai and the frozen vans of the hidden homeless, points to a state that has fundamentally abandoned its people to serve a global elite. The unseen wonders are the walls of a cage. The archipelago is not a lifeboat for humanity, it is a lifeboat for the 0.1%. The investigation has uncovered a nation that is being prepared as the ultimate insurance policy for those who can afford the premium. The silence of the landscape is not a sign of peace, it is the silence of an archive that has been purged. The state-sponsored Paradise is a managed simulation designed to hide the ongoing reality of a digital and physical occupation. We have seen the truth of the hollow mountains and the poisoned relics, and we have seen the faces of the people who are being deleted from the scenery. The Vatican of the Pacific is the endpoint of a long history of erasure, a sanctuary built on a foundation of exclusion, where the beauty of the land is the final mask for the betrayal of the people. The investigation is over. The truth of the hidden regions is now visible, but the gates are already locked. The physical reality of the Southern Alps is no longer defined by open ranges, but by a sprawling network of high-security boundaries and legal exclusions. This is the fenced-off wasteland, a territory partitioned into private fiefdoms where the public is a trespasser in its own home. The state-sponsored protection of these billionaire estates has created a landscape of physical redaction. To the outsider, the high country looks like a vast, empty wilderness, but for the local resident, it is a maze of no entry signs and electronic gates. These fences are the physical manifestations of the social contract's collapse. They represent the moment the archipelago was formally divided between the owners of the world and the inhabitants of the land. The investigation into these property lines reveals that the most beautiful parts of the nation have been surgically removed from the collective consciousness. This is not conservation, it is an enclosure. By allowing the global 0.1% to carve out their own sovereign-like enclaves, the government has turned the great outdoors into a series of gated corridors. The wasteland is not a place of ruin, but a place of exclusion, a geography where the natural world has been put behind a paywall and the people have been pushed to the edge of the gravel. The fence is the ultimate symbol of the New Zealand, a wall that protects the few from the many, built on the very soil that was once promised as a common heritage. A forensic reflection on the people whose histories have been redacted reveals the true human cost of the sanctuary model. From the Ngatiwai families cleared from Haturu to the miners of Waiuta abandoned in the poison dust, the pattern of state-sponsored removal is consistent and cold. These are the people we were told to forget so that the brand could flourish. Their lives, their labor, and their losses are the unseen elements of the national story, hidden beneath the 4K aesthetics and the luxury lodge blueprints. The investigation into these forgotten narratives shows that the state views its citizens as temporary occupants of a high-value asset. When a group of people is no longer profitable or when they stand in the way of a billionaire's view, they are simply erased from the map. This is the dark engine of the pure narrative. The memory of the marginalized is a threat to the simulation of a prehistoric void. By acknowledging these people, we challenge the state's right to sell the land as an empty lifeboat. The unseen is not just what lies under the ground or behind the encryption, it is the collective trauma of a population that has been used and discarded to fund a paradise for someone else. These forgotten lives are the ghosts in the machine of the new archipelago, a silent witness to a century of displacement that continues to this day in the parking lots of the high country. The South Island is not an escape from the world's problems, it is the laboratory where the world's elite are perfecting the art of surviving them at the expense of everyone else. This is the core thesis of the investigation. The archipelago has become a testing ground for the ultimate retreat, a place where the systems of bulk surveillance, digital occupation, and physical fortification are being integrated into a single, functional fortress. The state is not just a protector of the land, it is a facilitator of this experiment. By providing the legal loopholes for citizenship and the technical infrastructure for the GCSB, the government has turned the nation into a high-tech survival cell. The elite are not here to save the world, they are here to ensure they are the only ones who survive its collapse. This laboratory of survival requires a compliant, monitored, and displaced population to function. The sanctuary is a controlled environment where the consequences of global extraction are managed through exclusion. The investigation proves that the New Zealand model is the blueprint for a future where the 0.1% can retreat to a pristine void while the rest of the planet deals with the fallout. The mountains are hollowed out not for the safety of the people, but for the continuity of a class that has already decided the rest of us are redundant. The final redaction of this investigation is the exposure of the unseen as the human price of a paradise designed for a global 0.1%. We have looked behind the white domes, inside the council archives, and through the frozen windows of the worker vans to find a nation that has traded its soul for a seat in a digital bunker. The archipelago is a partitioned reality where the truth is kept underwater and the people are kept behind a legal fence. The hidden regions are not geographical mysteries, they are the sites of active social clearances and industrial poisoning. The state-sponsored brand of Pure New Zealand is the mask for a predatory intelligence posture and a billionaire land grab. This is the paradigm shift, to see the country not as a sanctuary, but as a site of extreme fortification and exclusion. The unseen wonder is the scale of the betrayal. As the elite lock themselves into their subterranean Xanadus and the GCSB vacuums up the signals of the Pacific, the families who built this land are being pushed further into the shadows. The sanctuary is a cage, and the gates are already locked. The investigation ends here, but the reality for the people on the outside is just beginning. The mountains remain silent, the soil remains poisoned, and the lifeboat is already full. This is the final sentence on the paradise we were promised, a land that was never wild, never pure, and never truly ours.